Usually when one hears the word adaptation, you might be met with one of two general responses. One of positivity and excitement, but more usually one of negativity and pessimism. The latter is what you'll often hear from fans of novels being adapted, and sometimes even specific manga and comics. People will generally feel this way because they believe adaptations will never match the descriptive and detailed depth of the material. And while somewhat digestible if you worry about it from a thorough approach, makes no sense in the context of the point of the work. But how do you ascertain the point of a work of art? And where does an adaptation draw the line between faithful and reconstructive? Berserk's first volume released in 1990 with the Black Swordsman arc following Guts, who, on a surface level, seems like your average 80s badass. And on top of that, it is the arc least beloved by the community. No matter which way you see this first arc though, it is a fact it's followed by the adored Golden Age arc, a recount of Guts' life prior to the events of the Black Swordsman arc. Golden Age, as I'm sure every fan here knows, did something incredibly special when elucidating the ambiguity of Guts' character hinted at throughout Black Swordsman. The humanization of Guts over the course of Golden Age gave cause to the actions you've already witnessed him commit, especially as you watch him struggle with his inability to help others, the way he distances himself from everyone, the aggressive nihilistic tendencies this man perpetrates. It's all rationalized by the events in the Golden Age arc, although don't assume it endorses. Guts in the Black Swordsman arc is one of the most bestial portrayals of him in the series, and the fact this was able to be consistent really gave nuance to later parallels of him, where he often struggles with keeping the beast contained within him. But I'm not here to talk about the manga, although I would love to analyze every little bit of it. I wanted to compare the Black Swordsman and Golden Age arcs to the 1997 adaptation of both parts. But why am I doing this? The conversational value of Berserk adaptations over the past 22 years has always borne some fruit. Most often about whether it's a good idea to start the manga where the anime ends. Whether you think it is or not is all up to you, but I intend with this video to elaborate on what it means to consider the anime a reconstructive adaptation. Foremost, we must be privy to the fact that Kentaro Miura approved of all the changes that were made during production. This includes modification and even retconning of certain characters, a ton of censoring, and cutting material that would have extended the anime into supplementary parts. But most important of all, or at least for this video, is the shift in thematic focus. The idea that everything has a cause, naturally or supernaturally, is one of the ideas many Berserk fans agree to be the heart of Berserk's themes, causality and fate. This has prevailed throughout Berserk, whether it be dialogue, imagery, and especially within character development, where an entire character's defining traits might shift due to some realization made through the effects of the supernatural. Some great examples would be Farnes and Rickert, to name a few non-obvious picks. But in Berserk, the Swordwind Romance, yes, that's its actual name, these themes aren't as apparent. While they are still there, they're clouded by other themes, ones which tend to be easier to emote in other works, but not quite so extravagantly here.
There's no reason in particular. Do you really need one? Will you always be left doubting me when I lay down my life for you?
Dreams and ambition, friendship and camaraderie, loneliness and existentialism, causality and the supernatural, the driving themes of Berserk. But friendship and ambition exceed the most out of all in the Swordwind Romance. How is this so? What makes these themes pop out in contrast to the others? There's no need to look elsewhere than the presentation. The most obvious to address, namely, would be the visual and audio design, the mise en scène. While the character designs haven't changed much from the manga, only lacking in detail, how the world and its violence is displayed alters how we view their world. Rolling hills often topped by scores of cavalry, rivers that occasionally ripple with blood, and sometimes, unfortunately, bearing upon those who may not follow their own will. This is a land, or perhaps just a time, fashioned by inhumanity. The way these are presented feels almost out of a fever dream, and sometimes I get revelries of these exact tones. I get much of this due to the exquisite background art by Shichiro Kobayashi, the art director of Berserk, who's made backgrounds for other anime such as Angel's Egg, Urusei Yatsura Beautiful Dreamer, and Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro. The manga often splattered across the pages with severed limbs and grotesque insides, demonstrating how personal many of these battles are for the characters, whether they're up against a once friendly face or numerous foes they would never learn the names of. This helped to identify more of the existentialist themes and to connect us better to the characters going through these ordeals. The anime, in turn, placated the violence, turning down some of the gratuitousness, most likely to appeal to TV audiences, but in this wake was left an oddly satisfying appeal, very indicative of some of the more obscure violent OVAs of the 80s and 90s. The audio design, in turn, was handled really well and helped to get that same impact the manga was able to emulate solely with illustrations. But the music, that's a whole other can of worms. Susumu Hirasawa successfully composed one of the most distinguishable opuses in anime. While I'm not the most musically astute person, however, even I can recognize the stark contrast between each track and how they all pervade with a similar dreamlike aura. It's amazing, too, that the entire soundtrack is only about 30 minutes in length, surpassing a single episode span by a few minutes. What this entails is seldom utilization of every track. I particularly enjoy Earth and Behelit, for whenever they're used, the mood is evoked ever further. Earth is the most cheerful and most mystical track, enhancing moments such as the end of episode 3, where everything starts to seem more at ease. I love the usage of bagpipes as I'm pulled into the setting. With Behelit, the strumming of the harp, often attuned to divinity in classical compositions, is turned on its head here, far more decadent and perverted. The Indian flute playing added to the exoticness of the feel, making every scene it's used in saturated with alienation. But if I had to choose which track out of them all as the identity of Berserk, I could not look further than Guts. Guts epitomizes a multitude of emotions, all of which ranging from the most depressing of thoughts, such as isolation and dread, to the incomprehension of emotion entirely. I can only begin to understand with every sorrowful ping of the piano striking a chord in me. Its self-reflective nature is caused by its washed-out, warbled chorus and feverish bohemianism. It's a cacophony of dejection, tinged with thoughts of bitter self-actualization. I don't think there could ever be another song that defines Berserk so aptly, nor its characters. Before I go on about plot parallels, I wanted to quickly mention some lesser points that added to the pacing of the show, particularly the addition of numerous scenes involving Adon Korbowitz and General Bascan, as they're built up a bit more properly in the anime than in the manga. Secondly, there's also how they were able to use this padding to add more depth to Griffith's rise to power, as he had to obtain knighthood before he became a count, where in the manga he was rewarded with the title only after saving the king's army. Now, on to the very first episode of the anime, one I'm sure we all know well. Titled The Black Swordsman, this episode is used to encompass everything of what the Black Swordsman arc represents, only while handling its first chapter. I always found the Black Swordsman arc to be needlessly long and going over the same ideas too much. Rather than being safe in its consistency, too much of it made it feel drawn out and cumbersome. Personally, I preferred Lost Children chapter in the Conviction arc, as it sort of... Fuck you, Sky. You sent me a fucking message on Twitter. Personally, I preferred Lost Children chapter in the Conviction arc, as it sort of did the same thing overall, but better. Still though, I have some nostalgia for how the first episode of the anime was handled. I always end up drawing similarities between it and Bastard, or other fantasy OVAs from the 90s. The episode successfully foreshadows the events of Golden Age and makes us wonder what could have happened to Guts to send him down such a torrential rage. But the way it barely connects to the second episode, it's somewhat hypnotic in how out of place it feels in the show. The second episode is where the Golden Age begins, acting as a flashback and retelling of the events prior to the first episode, and this will be true throughout the rest of the show. Yes, the first episode is chronologically the finale, but let's not worry about that until we reach that bitter end. I have 3 major points I want to discuss from within the show. The fans will know them very well, but for time's sake, I won't spend too much time here building them up. First, I'd like to mention that I had originally planned a side-by-side comparison of the anime and manga throughout the entire video, but after realizing how boring that kind of topic is, I decided to center in on the themes of the anime versus the manga. So I apologize if the pacing of the next couple of paragraphs is a bit inconcise, as they were mostly centered around this. While episode 10 proceeds canonically, there's an inconsistency in the speech between Griffith and Princess Charlotte compared to the official translation of the manga chapter. To give context, this scene is Griffith wooing Charlotte, as that is what he has to do to obtain his dream, which is to become a king. First of all, there is a part of the speech cut out due to going over the social status topic from the end of episode 4, the scene that was anime only. Second of all, the dialogue in the show gives off a wider grasp on dreams, where in the manga it feels more insincere.
Some see nothing more than life and death. They are dead, for they have no dreams.
This is a much more compelling rewording than the more existentialist, a man should envision such a lifetime once, a life spent as a martyr to the god-named dream, ultimately to be born and to then simply live for no better reason I can't abide such a lifestyle. The former gives a more direct answer to the idea of being without a goal, saying that a man is better dead, or rather is already dead, if he has no goal, implying to Guts that he's simply a walking dead man. The latter, while more poetic in its structure, only seems to make Griffith out as disagreeing with such a mindset rather than completely condemning it. This is why I believe the rewording is a more impactful reason for Guts to leave everything behind, rather than Griffith simply disagreeing with his lifestyle. Lastly, there's the closing statement that left Guts and his people did state. In the anime, there is a consistency in his tone that I really liked.
In my mind, a true friend never relies on another's dream. The man who would be my friend must have his own reason for living, beyond me. And he should put his heart and soul into protecting his dream. He should never hesitate to defend it, even against me. For me to call a man my friend, he must be equal to me in all respects.
He is condemning of those without a dream in the first statement, and affirmative with those who are equal to him, those who follow their own dreams without leeching off another. As expected, the tone is also consistent in the manga, with pauses and poshness alike, and there isn't really too much I can add that I haven't already said about this speech. Someone who would depend upon another's dream. Someone who wouldn't be compelled by anyone, but would determine and pursue his own reason to live. And should anyone trample that dream, he would oppose him, body and soul, even if the threat were me myself. What I think a friend is one who is my equal. I think the anime one is better for what it's doing, and the manga one good in its own right, except actually for one thing. There's something to the manga's dialogue that feels forced, and I mean in an authentic way. It feels like Griffith was trying to grasp for words to seem convincing, where in the anime he keeps his firm tone like he knows what he wants to say, and as though he genuinely feels this. If I wanted to take this further, I could probably make an entire topic on how Griffith in the anime is a very different character from how he is in the manga, but I should move on to my next point. It should first be mentioned that Guts' existentialism has two primary moments, one as he's fighting the 100 mercenaries and the other one right after, as he's sort of philosophizing to Casca a little bit. It's never said, but we're led to believe Guts isn't really a smart guy, especially in moments like on the hill where his word choice is incredibly awkward, like he's speaking as a middle schooler. Although I don't mean to demean what he's saying, I just think that this difficult grasp on reality makes him a more compelling character because, like us, he struggles with finding his place in the world. The point of this bit is to show where they were able to properly adapt themes of existentialism to the anime's more dream-centered storytelling, since there are very little differences between the anime and manga here. Except for one that caught my eye. While making comparisons, I noticed that one of the differences in translations between the manga and anime is that anime Guts made an absolute statement.
In truth, I don't believe that's any way to live one's life.
He then succeeds this by talking about how he was raised by Gambino. Guts never made an absolute statement in the manga here though, and the words weren't really said in this way at all. I find that the word choice here, whether it's accidental or not, pays homage to Griffith's absolute on his distaste towards such lifestyles. It's almost as though Guts is trying to agree with Griffith and go on his own journey of self-betterment just so that he may truly become friends with him. It kind of hit home for me, as reflection for the sake of others isn't genuine at all. The climactic event of the Golden Age arc. The Eclipse is where everything converges. Every event, happening, etc. is where it all leads as it is destined. Or is it? This is another point where both causality and dreams are at the forefront of the story, together, although this time in disharmony. The Eclipse is the battle between an Ubermensch's goal and the herd which brought it to where the goal is now. As a fan of Elder Scrolls lore, I could almost call this an enantiomorphic event, as many of the requirements are filled out to fulfill the formula. Alas, I'm not here to bore you with romanticisms and pedantic fanaticism, rather how differently the Eclipse is portrayed in the anime, although that might have already been obvious. One of the most prevalent pieces of information is how the Eclipse plays out. There's so much to take away from the Eclipse that you might need the observations of more than 3 people to get a better grasp on the events of it. What certain aspects mean in correspondence to other philosophies like that of Nietzsche, or maybe the rejection of Hegelianism, etc., are a couple interesting takes I thought up on the fly, with the former being more widely discussed. But even if what other people might think is interesting, it doesn't defeat the fact that the Eclipse is one of the most gut-wrenching pieces of horror in any media. Seeing the sacrifice of all these characters we got to know over time really hits hard, especially at the very end with what we're forced to witness. I'm actually a really queasy person, so the first time I watched this part I cringed in horror when Guts... well, yeah, I still do to this day, in fact. It's something I can't get over. There's a lot to discuss here that I really would love to sometime, but this isn't the video for that. Focusing back onto the point I really wanted to discuss, how's the Eclipse different in the anime than in the manga? What every Berserk fan will tell you is how they ended it. The show, I mean. Like, it just ends right there. Yeah, this isn't edited at all, it goes straight to the ED. It's out of nowhere, catching everyone off guard. Not a single satisfying conclusion is to be had. Just watch the post-credits scene, wonder how the hell Guts escaped the Eclipse, then watch the first episode over again. There are so many unanswered questions, and yet I love this! To put it in an analogy some fans might understand, I truly feel like Ricker in a few instances, and it would be a long while before we would get another adaptation that goes further than the events of the Eclipse. 14 to 15 years to be precise. Although within this time, the manga would continue and crawl to a halt numerous times. Speaking of crawling to a halt, how about this video? I kind of feel the quality of what was being said kind of dimmed over the course of it all, but overall I'm somewhat proud of this project. I spent weeks on this going through numerous cases of writer's block just trying to get it done. It doesn't really defeat the fact Berserk is one of my all-time favorite pieces of media, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. I'm actually still working on catching up with the manga, as I'm buying all the manga physically. I'm on volume 23, by the way. The impact this series has had on me is matched only by a few things. If you have anything to say, I'd love if you'd mention it down in the comments. I love having discussions with people about these sorts of things. And on that note, I'll take my leave. Thank you for watching.
All right, who's gonna jerk me off?